think that if it was a diagnosis was required at some point previous to the day for sort of culture to say, yes, that person is trans because they got a diagnosis. But I'm understanding that today it's not required, so what's the application in society? Like, could a prison deny someone hormones and say you don't have a diagnosis, or could schools say we're only going to treat trans people as trans if they have a diagnosis? What's the
so they can't. The question is, can a school or prison or other governmental agency use the presence or lack thereof of a gender dysphoria diagnosis as a basis for discrimination? No, they can't. Right, with the exception, I think, when you're talking about medical treatment, right? Because what we're talking about in the context of medical treatment, you're saying that, you know, puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or gender-confirming surgeries are treatment for gender dysphoria. So they're going to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to get access to that treatment. But when it comes, for example, to treating a trans kid consistent with their gender identity in school, no, there doesn't have to be a diagnosis. Not at all. All that matters is that the kid comes and says, I know I'm registered as a boy, but I'm really a girl, or vice versa. In fact, one of the resources I would encourage you to check out, as a result of Arcadia, the school district agreed to create a policy that supported non-discrimination for trans kids. And one of the things that they wrote in that policy is that it's really just the student's self-declaration, that there's no requirement for anything else beyond that. You know, and what we tell schools too is that if you're really worried that this kid, you know, is asserting the trans identity for an improper purpose, that's when you can sort of step in. These very rare situations, then you can say, okay, I'd like to, you know, but you need to make it not onerous because they may not have parent support. So, you know, maybe it can be a letter from a community member that knows this student. So, you know, if there's an LGBT center, and they can write a letter saying, you know, so-and-so has come to the, you know, our center for the past 5 months and is always identified as female. So it needs to be sensitive to the realities of trans kids, that they're not out in all contexts and it may be dangerous for them to be out. But it's going to be extraordinarily rare. Yeah. So just since you brought that up, one thing I didn't mention is OCR also enforces Section 504, the ADA, and Title VI. So if you have other discrimination claims like race discrimination or religious discrimination, those would also go to OCR, and you certainly can have all of them at the same time.
Linus, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, there's what's legal and what's supposed to happen, and then there's what really does happen. And I know GenderBenders is in upstate South Carolina, right? Very similar to a lot of the rural southern communities that we work in. Would you talk a little bit about your experience and what's it like on the ground?
Okay, so from an education standpoint, I came out as transgender while I was in college, actually at Furman University. And it's interesting. Furman University actually has a non-discrimination policy that does include gender identity. But a lot of it for me has been a social navigation, sort of a question of how difficult is this going to make classes, how difficult is it going to be for housing, that sort of thing. We currently, I know Furman has not followed through on housing well at all, so that's definitely an issue. And they do not have options for gender neutral housing. They are working on that, I believe, but that could be a very slow process. I've never heard complaints about restroom usage, but I don't know. I mean, we're also a pretty small school, so I mean, I know plenty of trans people there, but how many are actually out and trying to make these changes, or even possibly in the clause as trans, but living as their identity? I'm not sure. We definitely don't have any sports teams that are not segregated. Do you have any other specific questions on it?
No.
What would be typical accommodations for non-binary
That's a good question, and I think that's something that is still being explored. People really don't know how to deal with us in society.
What accommodations would you want?
I would like fully gender neutral everything, honestly. There are some gender neutral bathrooms scattered across campus, not enough, but some that I can go to. I occasionally will use either restroom, binary genders. Have not had an issue with it yet, but I'm also very socially aware of whether I think that it could be an issue and avoid those situations.
So you want the right to be able to enter either bathroom?
If there were,
And I know that's different for everybody.
yeah, if there were, in the absence of gender neutral options, I would want the right to enter either one. If there were gender neutral options, I'm fine not going into either one because neither of those things are me. And if people really, really want to have, those separated spaces, I'm fine staying out of them.
Another accommodation could be inside the classroom when doing projects to never just separate by boys and girls.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, pointing out all the ways we separate, outside of sex-separated facilities and activities. In fact, I dropped my kids off for the first day of first grade last year, and the first thing the teacher does is, okay, boys and girls, line up, boys here and girls here. I'm like, why?
Why? Yeah.
There's no need to really do that. And sometimes, I've worked with a family in Louisiana where the school separated boys and girls in the lunch lines. I'm getting lunch. Why do you need to separate boys and girls? You say, if the line gets too long, just create a second line.
I think especially for like preschool and kindergarten education, I think it's particularly important to think about how you're teaching them ideas of gender. I'm really passionate about working with very, very young children, and that's when kids are learning about, like you said, people are often aware of their gender identity as early as 2 and 4. Like that's where you need to be educating. So if you're having all of these like nameplates with like the boys have truck stickers, and the girls have flower stickers, like there's little things like that that you don't think necessarily are harmful, but I've found that they can be really destructive.
Yeah, another great point that gender separations start early, and they're early and often. And I think a really great study to point out is a study done by GLSEN called Playgrounds and Prejudice, and it's about gender in elementary schools, and really showing not only that it happens, that gender policing really happens in elementary schools, but that teachers feel woefully unprepared to address it.
I wonder if you could speak more about the ways you've seen teachers and other school workers be useful and helpful in the cases that you have worked on. I know how, I certainly know that teachers are often not helpful, but in what ways have teachers been effective advocates?
I think teachers can be great advocates, keeping this issue up in front of the principal and other administrators, or continuing to raise this issue, or to be supportive even if the school district is not being supportive. I think it's really getting as much education into the school as possible, talking to your peers, getting them on board, trying to be supportive of, trans kids and their families. If the families aren't supportive, so doing that kind of work can be extraordinarily helpful. And also teaching LGBT inclusive curriculum. My one note of caution about the LGBT inclusive curriculum is that the First Amendment rights of teachers are next to nothing. And so that can be really, really difficult for teachers to do because you could be risking your job. But that's what teachers can do. Teachers can play a huge role in creating a safe and supportive environment. So.
I think pre-service teachers can also challenge their teacher prep programs to do a better job of incorporating some of these philosophies and ideas.
Yeah, getting this information to teacher education programs is really important because it's constantly changing, and it's important to have that as part of your continuing education as well.
We're in the South, so I can't envision it, but are you seeing in some states out west or elsewhere that they're actually doing true gender neutrality in some kindergartens? I mean, leaving off genders off role things, I mean, it seems like that'd be the goal. Is it happening already?
You know, I think the difficulty, I don't know about sort of the sort of daily practices of not lining up kids, boys and girls and all that kind of stuff. I think that the issue with kindergartens and sometimes first grade classes is they have a bathroom in the classroom, so they think, okay, well that just takes care of it, right? They don't really think beyond that, unfortunately. I'll get to your question. I want to go ahead.
I was more kind of like a comment-ish. So I find it really difficult to wrap my head around the fact that the school has to be like a hostile environment for a child who's getting beaten, and like in the cases where these children are getting like hospitalized, and I mean it seems like there's nothing happening for the other students that are responding, like the principal saying, well, if you weren't so gay, but then you know there are examples of like say a student gets punched in the face and defends themselves, and then they're suspended for a couple of weeks because they created that space. But it's just like, well, it doesn't matter if that child is trans, if they're black, if they're Asian, if they're whatever, if they're purple. I mean, really, it still creates this fact that you're letting other children, you're giving this message that it's okay to go and beat the bloody pulp out of somebody just because you don't agree with their identity. And I don't understand why that's okay. Well, not that it's okay, but like, I don't understand why these cases keep springing up when assault is assault.
Yeah, and so there is a difference, right, between criminal liability for assault and civil liability for a hostile school environment. I think another thing to point out, and this is getting into weeds a little bit, but the reason why the U.S. Supreme Court set the bar so high is because, well, first of all, judges don't like to be involved in educational decisions. I think it's inappropriate for them. They kind of feel like it's not really their realm. But more importantly, because this is the federal government stepping in, and schools have really been a sort of state issue or state sort of sovereignty, they really want to tread lightly. Other states that have state-level anti-discrimination laws, some of them have adopted that standard. So California uses the same standard, but New Jersey doesn't. New Jersey uses a much more friendly standard, friendly to students. It only requires constructive notice, so that you know whether they knew or should have known. So it's a much lower standard, and does not require deliberate indifference. So the reason why it's so high is more based on the sort of unique aspects of Title IX rather than wanting to stop sex discrimination. I do want to point out really quickly though, since I do have a little bit more time, is sort of what the legal landscape is looking like. And some of you may be familiar with the ACLU's case out of Gloucester County, Virginia, GG versus Gloucester. And in that case, they represent a transgender boy who was denied access to the boys' restroom. And the trial court said that that's okay. And that's currently on appeal before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so a lot of school districts are saying, look, we're just going to hold out. We're going to find out what this court says, and then we'll go from there. And I think the reality is that just because that's what that court says doesn't mean the court in your state is going to say that. And really also the reason why I start with the sort of educational, moral, and ethical approach is like, okay, Title IX really creates a floor, right? Do you want to say, I did the bare minimum so I don't get sued? Does that sound nice? Is that good? Right.
I wanted to ask real quick, oh no, I'm sorry. You were
That's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask real quick about the role sports can kind of play in possibly bridging or possibly breaking down some of these barriers, because before Title IX, sports were pretty much just available to boys, and then part of the response was to make a lot more girls teams available. Right now, the only two sports I'm aware of that don't have a boys team and a girls team other than baseball, softball, is football and wrestling. And I mean, and I'm not going to get into the NCAA or the NFL or all their issues, But as a football coach myself, you know, for a team that a couple years ago did have a cisgender girl kicker for the team, and that's starting to be a slightly more common thing in terms of seeing girls come out for the football team that required that opportunity. Do you think that kind of going forward from here, that it would be better to start breaking down the differences between a boys track team, girls track team, boys volleyball, girls volleyball, and kind of get back towards, you know, like just A team, B team, something like that? Or do you think that sports like football or like wrestling, where there is no line drawn for gender or for biological sex, that those would be better opportunities to kind of make the sporting environment more inclusive?
That's a great question, whether or not the sort of end goal is to create more sort of gender neutral teams or non-gender specific teams. You know, I think they should be made available, whether or not, you know, they sort of eliminate the boys teams and men's and women's teams, however you want to characterize it. You know, I don't know about that. I don't think we'll ever get to that point. But, you know, interestingly, looking at Title IX, that's another thing that sort of comes up in the sports context where, you know, parents will say, well, that transgender kid is going to take up all the college scholarships from other girls, right? Or take spots from other girls. And Title IX was supposed to be there to sort of preserve the, you know, a spot for women to be able to play sports. So it kind of cuts both ways on the Title IX part of it.
I had a couple of questions real quick.
Sure.
We'll look into one. The timeline for OCR, I wondered if you could speak to that. And then the OCR is out of Chicago, I believe it was, for the locker room. And then lastly, didn't the Department of Education put out guidance on what they meant by gender and gender identity, kind of affirming so that, I mean, it kind of clarified.
Okay, so all great questions. So you have to file a complaint within 180 days of the last act of discrimination. But it takes them a long time to process. They've got so many complaints, and they're also, it's an executive agency, so it's subject to political whims. And so Arcadia took about 2 years. So, you know, they're supposed to try and resolve them within 6 months, but it typically doesn't happen. For Palatine, in that case, the student said, you know, I want to change in the girls' locker room. The school said you can, but you have to change behind a privacy curtain. And the student's response was, I'll change behind the privacy curtain because that's what I want to do, but you can't require me to. And OCR said that was a violation of Title IX. And ultimately, they entered into a resolution agreement there. Unfortunately, OCR backed down a little bit, initially saying, no, that applied to the whole school, but then sort of conceding that it just applied to that student, which is, you know, unfortunate. They have not put out guidance specifically sort of outlining what they expect. The closest we have is the Arcadia policy. But they have had, you know, in other guidance documents, like they came out with a guidance about sexual harassment and sexual assault on college campuses, and they said, you know, that includes transgender people. Or they came out with a guidance on sex-separated education. So if you have a transgender student, you have to educate them based on gender, or, you know, allow them access based on gender identity. So they have done those things, but they haven't come out with like, this is how we expect you to treat trans kids in all these various contexts.
With respect to statute of limitations and discrimination law and disability discrimination, how does it differ as to your understanding that you were discriminated against and actual discrimination? Because sometimes people don't realize right away that what they experienced was discrimination or fell under the category of disability discrimination. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah.
In terms of statute of limitations, is it from the time you experienced it, or is it from the time that you realized it was discrimination, or you put together what happened? I mean, sometimes when people experience various types of discrimination, it takes them a while to put together mentally and as to what happened.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you start calculating a statute of limitations? And so the law really divides that question into distinct categories. There's discrete acts of discrimination, which in the employment context, for example, would be firing, firing, demotion, refusal to promote, those kinds of things. In the school context would be, push out, discipline, like an expulsion, but something that has a date certain to it that you could, and that's when the statute of limitations on those claims start to run, from the date that it happens. The hostile school environment claim is a continuing violation claim. So the date it starts running is the last day, the last incident that created the hostile school environment. So if a kid is getting, bullied every day for an entire school year, and then at the end of that school year it stops magically, the statute of limitations start running on that last day of the school year. So it's not based on whether or not they knew they were discriminated against, unfortunately.
I'm thinking, there are a lot of various different, that would go beyond just the schools in terms of discrimination and have statute of limitations would apply. I wasn't sure how that.
Yeah, and sometimes states will, and the statute of limitations will vary state by state. Federal law pulls from state law in terms of what the statute of limitations is. So some states, particularly when it involves minors, they have a longer statute of limitations. So that's something to be aware of.
It's the shortest time period, 180 days.
The 180 days is only for the administrative complaint.
What would the law usually be? The shortest?
In California, it's 2 years, and that's probably pretty typical. Some states get up to 3 years, but 2 years is pretty common. And one thing to keep in mind if you are bringing state claims is you typically have a State Tort Claims Act notice requirement. So you have to notify the school district that you're bringing state law claims against them. But that, again, will vary state to state.
For Virginia, someone was talking about Gatlinburg, also like I'll include the part about Fairfax County and Liberty Council trying to overturn their positive policy and losing.
Yes.
But that's not the reason I'm raising I want to talk to Linas. Retirement age. Old guy, non-binary, know what it is, don't really think a whole lot about it. Work on advocacy in regard to state law and such, and in the fight over dealing with the bathroom laws and transgender. And it just hadn't gotten from here to right here until one day I was at a table talking to some young activists who made a statement that all restrooms should be gender neutral. Which I'm not opposed to. I don't see that as a problem, except right now. It's years down the road. So my fear is, what happens if some folks that come into the conversation, testimony in the General Assembly start talking about all bathrooms should be gender neutral, as the right meeting go, they don't know what they want to. And so we're going to have them trying to divide and conquer us on trying to actually give trans people access to the restroom that matches their GI now. So if I misstated anything there, or I apologize, you understand what I'm trying to.
Yeah, so I think you're asking about if there's a conflict between letting binary trans people access the appropriate facilities for their gender and abolishing gender policing in facilities in general. And I think that they're going about things in a slightly different way, and I think that people can be sort of activists towards different directions, but I haven't met anyone who is advocating for completely gender-neutral facilities who is against binary trans people accessing the facilities that are existing for their gender. So in my opinion, if there are any binary facilities, trans people have the right to access whichever one they want. But I would prefer it if there were no gendered facilities.
Sorry, go ahead.
And as far as trying to divide and conquer, I think that could come up in any situation. So I think that it would be good, like if you're going into a legal battle, to have a decision of this is what we're going to present for this argument, but that doesn't necessarily have to impact the actual activism that is going on in the community and in other legal cases.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that we need to be careful when we talk about access to restrooms, it's not the restroom that they choose to go in is the restroom that's consistent with their gender identity or matches their gender identity, or matches their gender actually, even better. Because, as you may have seen, there was a guy in Washington who decided that he could go into the girls' locker room at a local pool, claiming, oh, well, now the state law allows people to choose whatever bathroom they want to go into. That's not true, right? It's still, the law still polices who can go into which, but they have to go in based on their gender. He was a man going into a women's facility, and so that was inappropriate. So we do have to be careful about language, because we're not talking about choice, right? We're talking about they're accessing facilities based on gender. And it's something immutable. It's not like, it's not a lifestyle, it's not any of that. Any other questions? We're now actually just about at closing time. And now that it's 5:30, even later than I thought I'd keep you. Thank you all again. We're both happy to stand up here and answer any questions, give out contact information, and all that kind of stuff. Thank you so much.